Hello. I wanted to pop in for a bit of a bonus episode. At the moment, I'm running a free webinar series, which I think might be really interesting to the listeners. So it's a 4-part series, and we've got one more tonight, the 1st of December, and the last one on Friday the 3rd. But that's fine if you've missed out. Well, you haven't missed out. It'll all be recorded and you can access those recordings. So I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. But essentially, I'm running a 4-part series as a brief introduction to youth mental health. So in the first session, looked at anxiety, some of the common signs and symptoms. In the second, depression. Later today I'll be talking a bit more about adolescent development, and the fourth one is around having difficult conversation. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about those areas, feel free to check out the link below in the show notes, and you'll have access to that those recordings. And today I wanted to talk a bit about how do we have some of these difficult conversations. We're just adjusting to the new the news about this new variant, and I know it's creating a little bit of angst and anxiety, and I'm getting a lot of inquiries from parents and from families around how to support their own teens. That's sort of my area of interest, is working with teens and families, and I thought I would bring some of that information into the Inside Social Work podcast. I know a lot of social workers tend to be the air quote, the therapist for their friends and family, and sometimes it can be really hard to take off your social work hat, or if you're a clinician or a therapist, and bring it back down to basics. So I really wanted to give you some of my top tips on how to have these difficult conversations. So if you're worried about a friend, a family member, a housemate, it might be time to have that tough conversation. And these conversations go better when you're prepared, when you're calm, and you can be open-minded and non-judgmental. So my first tip there is to check in with yourself and think, am I in a position to have this conversation? Am I feeling calm? Am I in the right headspace? And if the answer is yes to all those things, pick your time and place. So this is really important, because if you're worried about someone who's distressed or experiencing poor mental health, where and when you have this conversation is incredibly important. So you want to consider picking a time that is, you're not going to be rushed, and that it's a space that you're both comfortable in. So you might not want to do this at a crowded cafe, for example, if that person feels like they might feel like it's too private a conversation to have, and you don't want to have it before you've got to rush off to do a shift, or you've got something in the oven that's going to be you're going to risk burning. You really want to make sure, if you choose to start this conversation, that you have the time and the place feels comfortable and safe. Once you start having this conversation, it's really important not to rush the person. So you might start off with asking questions about the behaviours you've noticed. Be careful not to criticise them. So don't say something like, look, you're being really lazy, or you haven't been cleaning up your room or the communal space. You can say, look, I've noticed that you haven't quite been yourself, and there have been times where you haven't seemed as motivated. I'd like to talk to you about this, or I'm a bit worried. So being really careful to pinpoint maybe some of the behaviours or some of the symptoms that you might notice without criticising the person. Listen, don't interrupt, and let them get things off their chest. This might be really hard because we often want to jump in and offer a solution, or we want to just fix it for them, or we want to reassure them that things are okay. So, think of an example where somebody might feel like they're hopeless and helpless, and they might be something like, I feel like I can never get it right. My boss is always on my case. I just feel like such a crappy worker, like I'm just no good. And maybe your instinct is to say, you're not crappy. I see how hard you work. This is really difficult. That has its place. But in that moment, it's really important to validate what that person's saying. And validating it doesn't mean you agree with them. It doesn't mean that by saying, that must feel really sucky, or that must feel so awful to sit there feeling like you can't do your job. That doesn't mean you agree with them. You don't agree with the belief that they can't actually do their job, but you really want to validate their experience in that moment. If you don't know what to say, you can say that. It's more helpful to say, I'm not sure what to say right now. I'm so glad you told me, or thank you for sharing, or wow, I didn't expect that. It caught me off guard. I want to make sure I say the right thing. Can I just have a moment? I'm going to get a cup of tea, glass of water, go to the bathroom, wash my face. Something that gives you a few moments to then come back and start that conversation again. So you don't have to have an immediate response. So having some standard lines, that must be really difficult. I can understand why you would feel that way if that's how you interpreted those, or that's what's coming across. Tell me more. Sounds really difficult. How are you coping? To feel like you're not doing well at work and that your boss is always on your case. I know how much you love your job and how hard you work. That must be really awful. How are you going with that? So we can validate and we can show concern. Please resist your instinct to interrupt with solutions. Don't interrupt. Don't offer solutions about what you would do, or there's another time, or, oh, don't be silly. Even if they say, I just don't know what to do right now, you can say, that sounds tough. I can see why you feel stuck. Be supportive and non-judgmental. Pause there for a moment. Even if you don't understand exactly what's going on, you can still be supportive. You can let them know they're not alone. And if they don't feel comfortable talking with you, it's okay to say, look, I feel like maybe I'm not the right person to talk to about this. How about we try, and you can recommend someone you know might be more appropriate or more equipped, or that person might feel more comfortable with. So when offering support, I really think it's important to be non-judgmental, and don't give advice without asking permission first. So let's say you've had a chat, you've picked your time, your place. It's a moment where you're both feeling calm. You've started this conversation. If you then think, actually, I have a really good idea for this, wait till, towards the end of the conversation. And then actually you could say, look, I've had something similar happen to me before, or one of my friends went through the same issue with their boss. Would it be helpful if I shared with you what they did? So asking for that permission. So they're some of the things I really want you to consider and keep in mind. Some of the things I think are worth avoiding, and this can be a little more difficult. If it's somebody that is younger than you, don't say things like, when I was your age, this might feel really unusual because we think it comes from a good place, right? Like, oh, when I was your age, I felt that same way about my boss, but we changed careers so many times over our life, you won't even remember it in this many years. That minimizes the experience and can come across sometimes as judgmental or critical, even if that wasn't your intention. So remember not to interject with comments like, when I was your age, or brushing those things off. You might be able to say, like I mentioned earlier, around, look, actually I went through something similar when I was your age. I know things have changed now, but I might have some ideas, or would it be helpful if I shared with you what worked and what I stuffed up and what I learned from it? So you could be really honest and ask that permission to give advice. The other thing I want you to avoid when having these conversations is don't minimize the problem or the issue. And I know that this is something I struggled with in my early career days is I found my tolerance for people's discomfort had kind of diminished because I was working in some really acute mental health settings, and I was working with a lot of people who had chronic homelessness and chronic trauma and a lot of things that had been happening for them. And I would come home and I'd hear people complain about things that felt really trivial. And I remember feeling, oh my goodness, do you really want me to show you how some other people live? And so I really had to check in with myself and think, it doesn't have to be comparative suffering. I don't have to minimize it. This is a person I care about or love, or it's a close friend, or, I value kindness. So even with this person I don't know really well, I want to show up in a way that makes them feel supported in that moment. So try not to minimize their problem or issue. If you're talking with younger people, don't say something like, oh, that's okay that you're having an issue with a friend. You won't be friends with them, past high school, it's fine. So don't disregard some of their emotions because it's, maybe it was different for you, or in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't feel that significant. In that moment for them, it might be. And try and avoid saying but. So this is a really common one, and I urge you to consider how you say things. So don't say, oh, I understand what you're going through, but, and then inserting feedback or response or advice. Yeah, so again, ask permission. I understand what you're going through. That sounds really tough. Validate, listen, empathize, be non-judgmental. If you then have some advice, ask, actually, what you were saying about your friendship issues made me think of this time that I went through blah, 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 or my friend had a similar issue. Could I share with you a bit more about that and see if it's helpful? So we can really flip it in a different way. The last couple I want to talk about is being overly positive. So this can feel really jarring for someone where we just want to make them feel good, being like, oh, that's fine, everything happens for a reason, or look on the bright side. So if we go back to that example of an employer not feeling respected by an employee not feeling respected by their employer, it's not great to say, well, you'll learn something from it, or everything happens for a reason, or there'll be another job that comes along that is so much better for you. That actually can feel really difficult and really hurtful to the person. And it can actually be dismissive and a little bit shaming. So if someone's experiencing distress, that might feel like a really... You might think it's a helpful thing to say, but it's often received as, this person can't listen to me, so I'm just going to have to squish down my feelings and pretend to be okay with things while I'm in front of them. Okay, so another thing we want to try and avoid is trivializing the person's experience. So this is when someone might say something like, oh, I was just feeling really overwhelmed, or, maybe they had a genuine panic attack, and we say something, to try and maybe relate, but that trivializes thing like, oh, I know I had a panic attack when I saw the cost of the insurance this month, or something like that. So it might seem kind-hearted and a genuine attempt to relate, but it can minimize the distress and it can fail to validate the person's experience. So we really want to try and avoid saying things that might accidentally trivialize the problem. Now, the last few are sort of things we've touched on briefly. So it's, we don't want to come up with solutions that are... we might think they're really helpful, but if someone's talking to us about their anxiety or their depression or being in a really rough patch, we don't want to say something like, have you tried yoga? That works for me. Or what about meditation? Again, if those are, they're very good strategies, of course, and we know the benefits of a mindful practice and meditation and relaxation. But in that moment, we need to listen, we need to validate, and then after all that, we might ask, hey, I don't know if this is helpful. I've heard that some people find breathing exercises really effective, or one thing I've used with my clients is XYZ. Do you think that might work? Or this is something I've found works for me. Have you thought of it? So we want to ease in, ask for permission before we offer those sorts of solutions. We don't want to be using guilt. So kind of like that bit I said earlier where I struggled to empathize with people whose problems maybe felt trivial in my early days. We don't want to actually comment on that. We don't want to say, oh, what have you got to complain about? Do you know there are people who have it much worse than you? So we really want to avoid things like that. That empathy doesn't run out. We can have empathy for all the people suffering all the things. Just because someone's situation might be objectively more difficult, it doesn't mean the person sitting in front of you isn't having a tough time. So we really want to give them permission to just feel their feelings, show compassion, show empathy, and not compare it to someone else. Okay. We also don't want to say things like just snap out of it, just get over it. Again, that can cause unnecessary distress, and it can actually prevent that person figuring out what's getting to the bottom of it. So many people actually find it quite tough to talk about how they're feeling, and so if they're being shut down, it might take them longer to figure it out. They might shut off a little bit more from other people. So we really don't want to say things like just get out of it, just grow out of it, snap out of it, that kind of thing. And the last tip, let's say you've done all of these things, you've thought about the ways to have the conversation, you've kept in mind the things not to say. What if it goes well, but they don't want help? That's okay. You can offer some, myth busting, like maybe, if it is a mental health concern and you've talked about going to the GP and seeing a therapist and they say no, you might actually say, look, I wonder why that might be. Do you feel like they will breach your privacy, or do you think it's going to be really uncomfortable, or do you think that's only for suicidal people? Like whatever, you can spend some time myth busting it. Maybe they've got some assumptions that aren't accurate, but you want to do that gently. You want to do that with curiosity. There might be some things that you can do that help them overcome their worries or concerns about seeking help. And if they still don't want help, that's okay. You can let them know if they change their mind. In the future, you'll be there to support them. If you perhaps notice things getting worse, maybe it's worth having another conversation down the track. But you must, respect their right not to seek help. So if you're worried about their mental health and they're, not opening up, or they're not wanting to seek support, that's okay. We want to keep, options for conversation open and dialogue open. You may want to revisit the conversation. There might be different approaches, but at the end of the day, they also have a right not to seek help, and we must respect their wishes. So I hope you found this helpful. I'll put a link to I've written blog posts about those topics, so I'll put some links to that in the show notes. And and see how you go with some of these tips, and armed with a few new tools and techniques to have conversations about someone whose mental health you're worried about. And remember, there'll be a link in the show notes as well to sign up for the mini mental health series that I'm running. It is a focus on working with young people, or if you've got children, living or working with teenagers, but it'll still be really relevant if you're an educator or you're a person who works in the mental health space with teenagers. It is a basic introduction. The webinars don't go for very long, but I strongly encourage people to check that out if they're interested. It might even be interesting to some of the parents or carers that you work with. And if you're in Melbourne, I'm running a 2-day workshop next week, Thursday the 9th and Friday the 10th of December, and this is a crash course in mental health. So it's an accredited program through Mental Health First Aid Australia, but it's a focus on youth. So it's the Youth Mental Health First Aid course, and I love it. I think that's actually going to be my 30th course, which is pretty impressive considering over the last 2 years we haven't been able to run them. So following from that, I will be a master instructor, which is super exciting. So in this course, it's 2 full days. I really, really highly recommend it. I honestly believe everybody should do a mental health first aid course. The insight that you get, the reflection, the learning, and also the ideas and suggestions from other participants. I mean, I run these as often as I can, and I still walk away feeling like I've learned something new from the beautiful participants that attend. So you'll learn a bit about some of the signs and symptoms to look out for anxiety, depression, eating disorders, trauma, psychosis, and alcohol and other drugs. And, we'll look at that in context of some of the developmental milestones happening for young people. So that kind of 12 to 25-year-old age bracket, we'll go through a bit of an action plan, kind of like physical first aid, where you have your doctor's ABC, and then we kind of apply that to some case studies and some opportunities to practice in small groups. So it's a really comprehensive program. You'll get a manual and a yummy, yummy lunch, and you'll get to hang out with me during the breaks as well. I really do love running these. Participants always find them really enjoyable and really relevant to their work because I don't know about you, but unlike physical first aid, I've never had to do CPR. I have had to ice a few sprained ankles and apply a few band-aids and put some burns under cold water. But my mental health first aid skills, I encounter situations almost daily, and I use this framework because being that first on scene or that first responder type position is very different to being a therapist. So as a therapist, I work more intensively with people. I get to know them really well, but some of these mental health first aid conversations can happen in just a few moments, and it's a really useful framework. So even if you're a very experienced clinician, I still encourage you to consider signing up. You can sign up with me for next week. I'm also running some over the year next year, and you can see all of the information for that on my private practice page, thetherapyhub.com.au, or you can check out some other instructors. There are instructors all over Australia through the mhfa.com.au or the .org website. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this little bonus episode, and it equips you with a few extra tips and tricks to have some conversations with people who are maybe in distress or whose mental health you're worried about.